When a fortress lost its empennage at 12,000 feet, what the crew did next. It sounds like an impossibility. A mechanical nightmare from which there is no awakening. A fortress severed from its very means of control, plunging through the frozen hell of enemy skies. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is the stark, terrifying reality faced by 10 American airmen on the afternoon of December 31st, 1943. Their Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress, nicknamed Bombs Away, was limping home from a brutal raid on the formidable port of Saint-Nazaire. At 12,000 feet over the hostile coast of occupied France, a collision with another crippled bomber would tear away their entire tail section. What followed was a 90-minute ordeal that would defy every principle of aeronautics, every expectation of survival, and test the limits of courage, ingenuity, and sheer human will. This is their story. To understand the magnitude of their crisis, we must first meet the men of Bombs Away and the strategic crucible that forged their mission. They were part of the 303rd Bombardment Group, the Hells Angels based at Molesworth, England. Their pilot and the aircraft's commander was 21-year-old First Lieutenant John Lucky G. Henderson. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Robert M. Andrews, was just 20. These were not grizzled veterans, but young men thrust into the most demanding aerial campaign in history, the combined bomber offensive against Fortress Europe. Their target that day, Saint-Nazaire, was a fortress in its own right. The German U-boat pens there were among the most heavily defended objectives in the West. Constructed with concrete over 20 feet thick, they were impervious to any bomb in the Allied arsenal. The only way to neutralize this submarine lair was to destroy the port facilities, the lock gates, and the town that supported it. The mission profile guaranteed a furious response. The Germans had layered the approaches with hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, 88 millimeters, and 105 millimeters flak batteries, and the Luftwaffe's fighter interceptor units were always lurking. The crew of Bombs Away was on their 7th mission. They were seasoned enough to know the drill, yet fresh enough for the fear to remain acute. The mission had been a maelstrom. As they began their bomb run, the German defenses erupted. The sky turned black with flak bursts, a deadly garden of fire and steel blossoming around the tight formations of B-17s. Shrapnel rattled against their fuselage like deadly hail. Fighters Focke-Wulf 190 seconds slashed through the bomber streams. Several fortresses were seen trailing smoke, falling out of formation, the beginning of a one-way journey down. Bombs Away had taken hits, but their systems were functional. They released their bombs over the target, turned for home, and began the long, anxious flight back to the Channel and the relative safety of England. They had survived the worst of it, or so they thought. The formation was ragged. The disciplined boxes that had crossed the coast hours before were now scattered, each damaged aircraft struggling to maintain speed and altitude. The bitter cold of high altitude seeped into the unheated fuselage, a constant companion to their fatigue. Below them, the patchwork of occupied France slid by, every field and village a potential place of capture or death. Bombs Away was flying in a loose group with other damaged bombers. Among them was another wounded B-17, its identity lost to the chaos of the mission. Both aircraft were vulnerable, their reduced speed making them prime targets for any remaining German fighters. The intercom was quiet, save for the steady drone of the 4 Cyclone engines and the occasional status check from the gunners. The crew was wounded, not in body, but in spirit, drained by the intense concentration and the adrenaline crash that followed the bomb run. At approximately 1,345 hours, the 2 damaged fortresses found themselves on a converging path. It was a tragic accident born of damaged controls, reduced visibility, and the sheer difficulty of maintaining precise formation with crippled aircraft. From the waist gunner's position of Bombs Away, Staff Sergeant Frank Doc Vinsky saw the other B-17 looming too large, too fast. She's coming in on us. His warning was a fraction of a second too late. There was a sickening, grinding crash of tearing metal. The entire aircraft shuddered violently, thrown into a momentary, uncontrollable yaw. For a heartbeat, there was confusion. Then, from the tail gunner, Sergeant Royski Nowakowski, came a scream over the intercom that froze the blood of every man on the plane. My God, the tail, it's gone. The whole damn tail is gone. What Nowakowski was seeing from his shattered plexiglass vantage point was not just damage. It was an annihilation. The other B-17's propeller had sheared through the empennage of bombs away the entire tail assembly. The horizontal stabilizers, the elevators, and the rudder were simply severed. A gaping, jagged hole was all that remained where the tail section joined the fuselage. Cables and control lines snapped and whipped uselessly in the 200-mile-per-hour slipstream. The other bomber, its wings sheared off, spun away into a fatal descent. Bombs away, now a grotesquely unbalanced tube of metal, began a slow, sickening nose-down spiral towards the earth. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Henderson and Andrews fought the controls with every ounce of their strength. It was futile. The control yokes jerked and slammed against their grip. The aircraft was no longer responding. They were not pilots anymore. They were passengers in a 10-ton projectile. The altimeter began to unwind. 11,500 feet, 11,000. The ground, previously a distant map, was now resolving into terrifying detail forests, roads, fields. The choice was stark and immediate: bail out over occupied territory and face almost certain capture, or ride the aircraft down to a catastrophic impact. Neither option promised survival. This was the moment of absolute crisis. At 10,500 feet, the fortress was in a deepening spiral, its death warrant seemingly signed. Fear, cold and absolute, gripped the crew. In the radio room, Technical Sergeant Edward Pop Ranelski, a man in his 30s and the old hand of the crew, made a swift calculation. Bailing out meant scattering, with a high probability of capture by the Germans or worse. Staying meant a unified fate. He made a decision and roared into the intercom, a voice of desperate authority cutting through the panic. Stay in the ship. Everybody stay in the ship. We might be able to level her. It was an act of incredible courage and faith. One by one, the gunners acknowledged, clambering away from their escape hatches, choosing to trust their pilots and each other. The fate of 10 men now rested on the actions of 2 young officers in a cockpit that had become a chaotic prison. Henderson, his mind racing, recalled a fragment of pilot lore, a theoretical discussion about flying with neutralized controls. If they could not control the aircraft aerodynamically, perhaps they could control it physically. He shouted to Andrews and to the flight engineer, Sergeant Bill McFadden, who had rushed forward. Wait, we have to use weight. Move the men, forward and aft, port and starboard. On my command. What they were attempting was preposterous. They would try to fly the gutted B-17 not with control surfaces, but by manual, shifting the center of gravity, using the bodies of the crew as living ballast. It was a concept belonging to gliders, not to a mortally wounded heavy bomber. McFadden coordinated over the intercom, his voice strained but clear. Waist gunners, move to the radio room now. Ball turret, get up here. Tail gunner, you need to crawl forward. Get as far from the break as you can. Now, move. The scene inside the fuselage was one of surreal struggle. Wearing heavy flight gear and parachutes, the men began to crawl and clamber over wreckage, through a fuselage shuddering and howling with wind from the torn tail. The slipstream screamed through the open wound, creating a deafening roar and a terrifying suction. Sergeant Nowakowski, extricating himself from the remains of his tailgun position, had to inch forward hand over hand, along a floor that was tilted at a 40-degree angle, with nothing but sky and the receding earth visible through the jagged opening behind him. By 1,400 hours, they had managed a crude redistribution. The spiral had slowed, but the aircraft was still descending relentlessly, now at 7,000 feet. They had traded a spin for a steep, uncontrolled dive. Henderson, his arms burning from the strain of holding the useless yoke, had another desperate idea. The B-17 still had power. The 4 engines were, miraculously, still running. Engine power, differential thrust, Mac, Andrews, help me. Number 1 and 2, reduce. 3 and 4, increase. We'll try to steer her like a boat. It was a stroke of brutal genius. By manipulating the throttles of the engines on each wing, they could create asymmetric thrust, potentially yawing the aircraft left or right. Combined with the crew weight shifting, it offered a ghost of control. For the next 20 agonizing minutes, the cockpit became a chamber of shouted commands and frantic lever movements. More on 3. Cut back on 1. Gunners, lean left, lean left. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose began to rise incrementally. The dive shallowed. At 3,000 feet, they were in a staggering, wallowing descent, but no longer in a spin or a dive. They were, in the most technical and terrifying sense, flying, but a new horror emerged. They were now below the cloud base, fully visible to every German soldier and fighter pilot in Brittany, and they were heading northwest directly towards the English Channel, a 120-mile expanse of cold winter water. They would never make it. Their altitude was a currency they were spending far too quickly. At 1,500 feet, the coast of France appeared to have the jagged cliffs and beaches of the Brittany Peninsula. The channel beyond was a forbidding gray slab. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Their glide slope, such as it was, would deposit them in the icy waters miles short of England. Ditching a B-17 in the channel was a deadly proposition even for an intact aircraft. For a plane with no tail, it would be a death sentence. The crew would have minutes, at best, to escape before the shattered hulk sank. First Lieutenant Henderson made a command decision. They would not attempt the channel. They would turn back and put the aircraft down on land, on enemy territory. It was a choice between certain death by drowning and a slim chance of survival, evasion, or capture on the ground. "We're turning south," he announced, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "We're landing in France." Using their painful, hard-won technique of throttle manipulation and weight shifting, they began a wide, lumbering turn. The aircraft responded like a drunken whale, but it responded. They were now flying parallel to the coast, searching for any piece of flat ground. Fields were small, hedgerow-bordered, and dotted with obstacles. Villages meant cables, houses, and civilians. Their airspeed was bleeding away, the stall warning shuddering through the airframe. Then, Sergeant McFadden, peering through the bomber's plexiglass nose, spotted it. A long, straight strip of relatively flat ground near the village of Plougane, a farmer's field, fallow for the winter. It was their only chance. Pilot, nose, gunner. Field at 11 o'clock. Long enough. Maybe. The approach was a nightmare. With no elevators, Henderson could not flare the aircraft for a proper landing. He could only cut power and attempt to hold the crippled fortress level as the ground rushed up. He shouted his final commands. "Crash positions, brace, brace, brace." The approach was a nightmare. With no elevators, Henderson could not flare the aircraft for a proper landing. He could only cut power and attempt to hold the crippled fortress level as the ground rushed up. He shouted his final commands. "Crash positions, brace, brace, brace." The men assumed their postures, back to bulkheads, hands locked behind their heads. The deafening roar of the engines faded to a whisper as Henderson pulled all 4 throttles to idle. A deathly quiet filled the aircraft, broken only by the shriek of wind. The impact was tremendous. The nose gear sheared off instantly. The massive bomber slammed onto its belly, plowing a deep, furrowing trench through the frozen French soil. It slewed to the left, tearing off a wing, and finally ground to a shuddering, dust-choked halt. Silence. Then, a voice. "Is everyone alive?" Sound off. One by one, through the smoke and dust, voices called out. Miraculously, all 10 men were conscious. Bruised, battered, bleeding from cuts, but alive. They had just performed an aerodynamic miracle and survived a crash landing in a plane that was, by all rights, already destroyed. But their ordeal was not over. They were in Nazi-occupied France. The crew of Bombs Away scrambled from the wreckage, expecting to see German troops converging on their position. For a precious few minutes, they were alone. Acting with remarkable presence of mind, they set about destroying sensitive equipment. Sergeant Ranalski smashed the IFF transponder and the Norden bomb site with a fire axe. Within 15 minutes, however, German soldiers from a local garrison arrived, followed by curious, then sympathetic, French civilians. The 10 Americans were taken prisoner. But their story was just beginning. The German military, upon inspecting the wreckage, was astounded. They could not comprehend how the aircraft had flown without a tail. The feat was considered aerodynamically impossible. The crew, interrogated separately, all told the same incredible story of weight shifting and throttle jockeying. Their captors, skeptical at first, came to believe them, treating the men with a degree of respect born of professional awe. All 10 men spent the remainder of the war as prisoners of war, enduring the privations of Stalag Luft III and other camps. But they endured it together, bound by an experience few could fathom. They were liberated in 1945 and returned home. The historical significance of the flight of bombs away is profound. It stands as one of the most extraordinary instances of airmanship in the history of aerial warfare. The crew's calm under ultimate pressure, their innovative use of basic physics to overcome a total systems failure, and their incredible teamwork saved their lives against impossible odds. For their actions, First Lieutenant John G. Henderson and Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant William McFadden were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. The other 8 crew members each received the Silver Star. Their medals were not just for surviving, but for executing, under fire and extreme duress, a feat of flying that redefined what was possible. The Boeing Air Company later studied the incident, using the data to improve the redundancy and survivability of future aircraft designs. The story of Bombs Away is a testament to the human spirit in the face of annihilation. It is a story not just of survival, but of intellect, teamwork, and raw courage triumphing over the cold laws of physics and the cruelty of war. 10 men in a shattered fortress refused to accept their fate, and in doing so, wrote themselves into the legend of the mighty Eighth. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.